So, welcome. I am pleased to welcome Mariano Plotkin to today's interview. Mariano is currently a senior researcher at the National Council of Scientific Research and a professor at history at the Universidad Nacional de Febrero, both in Argentina. He holds undergraduate degrees in history and economics, as well as a doctorate in history, the latter from the University of California, Berkeley. He's published very widely on the history of psychoanalysis in Argentina, the transnational diffusion of psychoanalytical discourse and practice, the political dimensions of therapeutic culture, as well as politics and society in Argentina, with a particular focus on the era of Juan Peron. According to Worldcat, looked this up yesterday, his most widely circulated books are Mañana es San Perón, A Cultural History of Perón's Argentina, Psychoanalysis and Politics, and Freud in the Pampas. He's a leading authority, I would say, in historical research on therapeutic cultures, and I'm therefore especially pleased about an opportunity to discuss your work. So welcome and thank you very much for doing this. So I've already said...
Thank you very much for your invitation.
So I've already said a little bit, but would you like to introduce yourself? How would you describe yourself as a scholar?
As a scholar, well, that's not an easy question to answer. I'm essentially a historian. That's what I am. I've been working on a variety of topics, therapeutic cultures and the history of psychoanalysis. Two of them, but they are not by no means the only ones I've been working on. At this moment, I'm sort of doing I wouldn't say a transition, but I'm trying to learn more about anthropology and trying to, in fact, my current research, which is being carried out in collaboration with an anthropologist and a linguist, is more anthropological or sociological than historical, I would say. But so I am sort of in the middle of these two disciplines at this moment.
Thank you. That's an interesting transition and something I would be keen to discuss later on. But first, let's start at the beginning of your trajectory as a scholar. How did you become an academic? Could you describe your professional and intellectual trajectory?
Well, sort of autobiography. Well, as you pointed out in your most kind introduction, I have a degree in history and a degree in economics because when I was an undergraduate, I was thinking about economic history as a possible career. Then I decided that it was not the case, and I did my PhD in history, and I moved towards, I would say, first political and cultural history, and then more cultural history than political. This book that you pointed out, that you mentioned, Mañana es San Perón, is my doctoral dissertation, in fact, and it was the first book I wrote. And it's a cultural history of Argentina during the Peron era. And from then, I moved to a history of psychoanalysis. But the way I moved to that is interesting because while I was living in Argentina, I'm living now in Argentina, but I was living before moving to the United States, where I lived for 15 years. Psychoanalysis was so naturalized for me that I didn't even think that it was a problem or anything studying. When I moved to the United States, I realized that for the first time in my life, none of my friends or my inner circle ever went into psychoanalytic therapy. Some of them didn't even know what psychoanalysis was. So then I realized that you have a historical problem, a problem that's something interesting to study. And then I remember one time I came back to visit to Argentina, and my aunt, who is a psychoanalyst incidentally, asked me about my budget, how much money I needed to live in the United States. And I said, well, I need so much for rent, so much for food, and so much for that. And she, at some point, she said, well, that's too little money. Oh, I realized why. Because there you don't go to therapy, you don't go to psychoanalysis there. So I realized that she was telling me two things. First of all, that psychoanalysis should be somehow not part of the person's budget. And second, that if you are there, in other words, not in Argentina, it's admissible that you don't go to psychoanalytic therapy. And then at that moment, although at this point I was working on my dissertation, I said, well, this is my next book, I know for sure. And then the third instance, which was revealing for me, was that when I started working on this book on psychoanalysis, it took me 10 years to write it. I thought out of my ignorance, that there probably would be a whole library of books on the history of psychoanalysis in Argentina, given the importance that psychoanalysis has in this country. Well, to my surprise, there was none at that point. Now there are a few, but at the point there was none. So that gave me the hint that, in fact, psychoanalysis was so naturalized that nobody thought that even it was worth studying. It's like something like, obvious. So it made me even more interested. I became more interested in the topic, and I realized that there was really an interesting problem there. So I've been working in the history of psychoanalysis as a cultural history of psychoanalysis in Argentina. Then I sort of broadened my scope to Brazil too, and I did some comparative work. And then I ended with these books on transnational dimension of psychoanalysis. And now I am this project on therapeutic culture in a broader sense. I want to talk about that later, I guess, but which is sort of a displacement from my early interest in psychoanalysis properly.
Understand. How would you explain, if you can think of an explanation, this absence of historical research on psychoanalysis or therapeutic cultures more broadly? This is something which I've also noticed along the way. My own research is not primarily historical, but it's certainly something which I've noticed, that there's very little historical research, both in Argentina and Latin America, as well as more broadly internationally, given that psychotherapy and psychoanalysis have been around for so long and that their cultural influence has been so massive. It's a gap in scholarship which I find quite striking.
Well, I wouldn't say that striking. I mean, you gave the answer to your own question. The fact that it's so broadly diffused, and the fact that it's so naturalized. I mean, you study something, you find something problematic in that. Otherwise, there is no question and nothing to study, right? So my feeling is that for many, many years, now the situation is completely different. There are a lot of groups working on different dimensions of the history of psychoanalysis and of psychotherapy and of therapeutic cultures in general. But during many, many decades, well, at least 3 or 4 decades, psychoanalysis was so naturalized for Argentine people that, like my aunt, for instance, or myself, I was sent to a shrink when I was 6 years old, and that was normal among the kids of my age, middle-class Jewish people, let's say. So that nobody thought that there was anything worth studying there. I mean, what is it there? I mean, so the first step to study the history of psychoanalysis, for me at least, it was to problematize it, to say, well, let's take a step backwards and look at that from a different perspective. There's nothing natural in that. There's something that is really needs to be explained. Because for many people, there's nothing to be explained. I mean, even today, if you talk to many psychoanalysts here, they would tell you that there is nothing to explain. I mean, that what had to be explained is why in other countries there are not so much psychoanalysts as here. The problem is elsewhere. I mean, if you're in Germany, everybody that doesn't go to the shrink, well, you have a problem. If the United States people don't go to then you have a problem. But so that was the first step, sort of what I call a sort of exoticization of psychoanalysis. I had to forget what I knew about that. I had to forget my own experience and try to look at it from a sort of semi-external perspective in order to understand that there was a problem and the problem it was worth studying.
Yes, I guess that's a step which some scholars at least still find difficult to make. I recently read a book review of the Handbook of Global Therapeutic Cultures, recently published by Routledge. You also contributed a chapter, of course, and the review was written by somebody who I think does straight mainline psychological research, and this reviewer noted how anxiety-provoking or troubling for him this cultural focus on psychotherapy or psychoanalysis really is.
Well, I found fascinating that review, because it starts with a quote of your introduction, I think, if I'm not wrong. And he was struck by the fact that you said that psychotherapy and therapeutic culture may have something which is not, kind of emancipatory dimension. And he was completely surprised by that, as if he had heard of that. So that shows how the thing can be naturalized and how certain how certain knowledge become received knowledge and become common sense, which is exactly what we have to question and we have to
Yes,
dismount
yes, yes,
somehow.
yes, 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 yes. So this point about psychoanalysis as defying the clear separation between science and common sense is also something which you have made in your writings, for example, recently in your article, Psychoanalysis as a Belief System. Could you explain this a little bit more? What you mean?
I didn't get exactly your question. Could you repeat it for me, please?
Yes, you've
I didn't hear.
you've previously also argued in your written work that psychoanalysis defies a clear separation between science and common sense. And
Oh
that's,
yeah,
I
I
think, a
understand.
very interesting point. You also just mentioned that in relation to this book review. So I was just wondering if you could explain this point a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I was involved in a project, in a collective book project, which is in Spanish, unfortunately, and is online, but it's free access, so it's interactive and has a lot of films and things in it. So I can give you later the link, which is called Saberes que desbordan, knowledge that overflows, something like that. Not exactly how to translate it into English. And I think that psychoanalysis is one of those forms of knowledge that originate in a kind of lettered, expert environment. After all, was invented by a medical doctor with some scientific credentials in Vienna. And then it overflows and it becomes common sense. Marxism is another such knowledge, if you look at the trajectory, this is why it would be very interesting. I didn't do it, but it would, perhaps my next project, to do a comparative history of the reception of Marxism and psychoanalysis. Two forms of knowledge that sort of originate in a kind of lettered, expert environment, and then overflow and become somehow common sense. I don't know if that makes sense in Europe or in China, but in this country, economics is something like that. Everybody here is an expert in economics, out of need of survival, I would have to say. But they can talk about things that in other environments are very, very limited to some expert group. And so I am interested in the process in which these different forms of knowledge sort of go from expert environments to popular culture, and sometimes vice versa. I mean, it's not a one-directional process. You have other forms of knowledge that sort of develop sort of in parallel forms in a broader society and expert circles, and then there is some kind of interaction between the way in which they develop. So that's something that interests me too, and this is I want to. And I try to apply it to psychoanalysis, which I think is a good example.
Yes, very much so. And
something else. Sorry,
yes.
No, I want to say that because psychoanalysis in itself, I couldn't care less, to be quite frankly. I am interested in psychoanalysis because all the things that it tells me about other things, in other words, about this kind of processes, how knowledge circulates transnationally, how knowledge circulates within a cultural space between expert circles and popular culture. I mean, these are the kind of things that I'm interested in. And psychoanalysis, I think, is an excellent example to study about all these issues.
Yes, it very much is. And since you asked how it is where I am, well, in China, precisely Marxism and now psychotherapy and psychoanalysis much more recently have made this journey from spheres of expert knowledge into popular culture.
Exactly.
So I think those are very widely.
I think that I have written this. I mean, it's not new, but I think that if you want to study the history, the historical development of any form of knowledge, you cannot distinguish it from the history of all the different appropriations and definitions and circulations that form of knowledge underwent, And now, if you're going to study the history of Marxism, of course, you have to read Marx's works, but you also have to read everything written that claims to be Marxist. And if you're going to study the history of psychoanalysis, which is one of the big transnational sort of form of system of beliefs and knowledge of the 20th century, like Marxism, You have to work on Freud's work and on the big psychoanalysts Lacan and Melanie Klein, but you also need to, to read when a newspaper claims that they are, a cartoon that says that they are doing some psychoanalysis or, popular writings or popular culture. I found in popular newspapers in Buenos Aires in the 1930s, whole section devoted to interpretation of dreams under a psychoanalytical point of view, which was whatever, doesn't matter. But they claim that. So the question is why they have to say that they are doing psychoanalysis for doing something else, And this is a kind of question that really interests me when a form of knowledge starts legitimizing other form of knowledge and other practices, And that was happening in psychoanalysis in the 1930s and 40s, at least in this country.
Yes. Why do you think that Argentinian society has been so particularly receptive to psychoanalysis?
Well, that's a
Very big
very
question.
complicated question that challenges any kind of simplistic answer. So I won't give any simplistic answer. There is a combination of factors, or determination of factors. Which has to do with many things. First of all, the fact that there was not. You have to distinguish different levels of reception of psychoanalysis. In medical circles, there's one thing, in popular culture is another thing. If you want to talk about medical sectors, psychoanalysis started, become known here in the 1910s, 1920s, and it was started to be accepted, I would say, in the end of 1920s, 1930s. The question is that in Argentina, first of all, there was no tradition, established scientific tradition, much less established psychiatric or psychological here. So people here were very receptive of anything coming from Europe. And psychoanalysis has many advantages of other possible therapeutic theories. First of all, because it not only serves to explain psychiatric conditions and problems, but it also can be used to explain broader social and cultural issues. Second, psychoanalysis has a theory, which may be good, may be bad, may be scientific, maybe not scientific, but still a theory. And in 1920s and 30s, most psychiatric, currents didn't have a theory that could be used or could be operative. For instance, when the shock therapy became widely spread around the world in the 1930s, some people thought that it worked, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but nobody knew exactly why it worked. There was not a real theory behind that you could say, well, this is the reason, there is the evidence, and so on and so forth. Well, psychoanalysis put forward a theory of why shock therapies worked, which you could say, well, that's nonsense, whatever, but it was still a theory, it was a reason, and it was believable, and it was, so in medical circles, it was very receptive to this kind of thing coming from Europe. The other reason why it was intellectual circles it was accepted. The reason was that as you probably know, during the 19th century throughout Latin America, different forms of positivism were very much popular intellectual elites. Since the 1910s, there was a rupture of that. There was a change in this paradigm, and then the neo-spiritualist, German neo-spiritualist, philosophical tendencies started to become spread for a variety of reasons. Among them, the consequences of World War I, right? Well, psychoanalysis was used by many people as a battering ram against positivism, with the people who prefer to look at the spiritual dimension of psychoanalysis. That was another reason I could say for the diffusion of psychoanalysis. So there are many reasons. Argentina, as you know, has a large European population. By 1910, 60% of the people living in Buenos Aires have been born in Europe, particularly in Italy, but also in other countries of Europe. So that, I guess, would be another reason. And then there are sort of internal reasons. Well, at the level of popular culture, there were again you can spot a variety of factors that I would say conditions of possibility. There is not one cause for that, for the diffusion of psychoanalysis. What you have are a set of conditions of possibility for the diffusion. Psychoanalysis, it was like a new language to talk about all passions, if you want, sexuality, dreams. These are things that were in popular culture forever, and have a scientific way of talking about that. In 1960s, it became very popular because it was, for the first time, there was a cohort of women psychologists who were practicing psychoanalysis who, for the first time, could talk to women about women's issues, things that before were in the realm of a priest or a medical doctor, who were usually men. So that also sort of was a... So, as I said, and then there is a political factor, of course. There is this wonderful piece by Karl Schorsk in this book, which is called Vienna fin de siècle, in which he shows how Freud himself went through a process of conversion between his sort of political activism towards a sort of internal activism. Freud was politically very active when he was young, and then he sort of substituted psychoanalysis for political activism. And in a country like Argentina, where since 1930s through the 1983, there were, I don't know how many coups d'etats, but over 10, where there was a, environment of censorship in which I grew up in 1960s and 70s. Psychoanalysis was a possibility of talking about other things, without having to talk about public things, let's say, an inward kind of subversion. And this is why the military, unlike received knowledge, why, I guess, is my hypothesis at least, why military dictatorships were not refractory to psychoanalysis. Because if I were a dictator, if I personally were a dictator, I would prefer that people who were talking about their belly bottoms and not about, politics in the street. So I would prefer to have all of them in a psychoanalytic consulting room. I'm not saying, of course, that there was any kind of association between psychoanalysis and dictatorship. Of course not. There were many psychoanalysts who were persecuted, and some of them were killed by the military. I'm just saying that there is a kind of environment which generated conditions that were auspicious for the diffusion of psychoanalysis. That's what I'm saying. So I could mention many more, but I guess this is enough.
Yes, thank you very much for this very detailed and interesting answer. There are 2 points of what you mentioned that I would like to pick up on. The first is the connection between psychoanalysis and politics. This is something which you've explored, like you said, quite a bit in your research. For example, in your book, Psychoanalysis and Politics. Why look at psychoanalysis from a political lens? And why connect it to this issue of restricted political freedom? Could you say a bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. As usual, these books or these projects start from a very simple question or something that really caught my attention. And it caught my attention that there were many scholars, and in fact, it received knowledge in certain environments. The fact that psychoanalysis can only sort of implant itself in societies where freedom is warranted in one way or the other, because psychoanalysis is the discourse of freedom of the unconscious, and therefore it cannot flourish in conditions of restricted political freedom. There are very, very, very important scholars like Elizabeth Rudinesco who has pointed that out and claims that. Argentina is an excellent counterexample. Brazil is too, I would say, because the explosion of psychoanalysis took place in 1960 and 70 when the country were living under horrible dictatorships where all the political freedoms were restricted. The same happened in Brazil. And then we started looking, because at that point I was the leader of an international group of scholars working on these topics, and both books, Transnational Unconscious and Psychoanalysis and Politics, came out from the same group, basically. And then we started looking at different places in the world, and we discovered that there was not only Argentina and Brazil. You could say a similar claim. You can make a similar claim for fascist Italy, for instance, where you can make a similar claim or say something on that way, on that direction for Vichy France. So there were many other instances in which psychoanalysis, some form of psychoanalysis, where I would like to say, and I want to say, and I don't want to be quoted saying, functional to authoritarian regimes or totalitarian regimes. But there, under certain conditions, I would say there is no reason why psychoanalysis couldn't develop under conditions of restricted political freedom. Well, we try to spot and to study a couple, not all of them, of course, because we left out, for instance, Nazi Germany, which is another example. In Nazi Germany, those psychoanalysis was forbidden because it was considered a Jewish science. Still, as you probably know, the cousin of Marshall Goering led a psychotherapeutic institution which basically was doing psychoanalysis or some form of psychoanalysis with different names, with different terminology, and so on. So, well, we try to study that just as a counterexample of this received knowledge that psychoanalysis can only develop on the conditions of political freedom. That was the purpose of the book.
I understand. And the second point, which I wanted to raise, concerns these transnational connections that cut across most of the issues which we've been discussing so far. This is again an area which has been very little explored, and where books such as your edited collection, The Transnational Unconscious, have therefore, I think, been very important, exploring all these transnational connections in the popularization of psychoanalytical and psychotherapeutic discourse and practice. Now, in The Transnational Unconscious, at one point you write that the transnational aspect of a system of thought, in this case psychoanalysis, cannot be understood without taking into consideration in a comparative fashion national patterns of reception and circulation. Could you explain this a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. Well, Transnational Unconscious was the first book of this group that, in fact, we co-directed with Professor Joy Damusi from the University of Melbourne. I took praise I didn't deserve because I said I was leading, were two of us. Well, that has to do with the whole issue of transnational history. Well, first of all, I think that transnational, the word transnational, addresses two different things. First of all, the nature of the object of study, and second, a kind of methodology of studying that object. In other words, the two different levels. In terms of objects of study, I guess some cultural artifacts can be characterized as transnational when it transcends national boundaries, cultural boundaries, travels from one place to the other, and the language in which it is spoken changes over time, and so on. On the other hand, transnational also may mean a methodology which really focuses or places its focus on precisely on these moments and flows from one place to the other across cultural and political boundaries. Having said that, I also believe that transnational history cannot be done really without looking at the local level too. I mean, after all, we don't live, no matter what we say, we don't live in a global world, because you're in China, I'm in Argentina, and there are certain different, always cultural differences. Still, the national state is a reference, and the current pandemic of coronavirus just showed that exactly. That still states think in their own terms, are thought in. So we don't live in a global world. We live in a world which has is more flexible in terms of mobility of ideas and symbols. I won't say people, because people still have problems to move, as you probably know. But yes, ideas and cultural artifacts, symbolic goods, and so forth, so on. So for me, the two dimensions are interesting if you really want to study a transnational study of something. One is to look at and to focus on those flows, on the movement, and then the second instance, which I think is as important as the first, is to see what happens when those cultural goods are received in a particular culture. So this is what the kind of problems we try to address in these books and in other publications that I have too. Try to see both dimensions of the transnational issue. On the one hand, the flows and the movement. On the other hand, what happened with this knowledge? What did Argentines, Brazilians, or Chileans, or whatever do with this knowledge when they got it, when they received it in some way, and why this form of knowledge enter into this particular cultural space in this particular moment, and not in other. So this is a kind of problematic that we wanted to address in this book.
Yes, yes. And as I said, I think it's an important contribution to this field because there's, again, very little research that has adopted this transnational focus, I would say, particularly when it comes to the popularization of psychoanalytical and psychotherapeutic thought. Now, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that your current work has taken a more anthropological turn. Would you like to explain this a little bit more? How are you making this transition from historical to anthropological research, and what is your current work about?
Well, I wouldn't say a transition exactly. I would say a back and forth movement. Okay. I consider myself a historian. Well, it has to do again with asking the naive questions, which is the best way to deconstruct, receive knowledge. After having written a lot on the history of psychoanalysis in Argentina, Latin America, and Brazil, I took a step backward at some point and I said, well, all this is fine, but wasn't I asking the wrong question? Or in other words, wasn't I answering my question before asking it? Because everything that I had written had as a point of departure that there was a huge diffusion of psychoanalysis in certain countries and certain areas, and I took it for granted. I took it as a day. And then I decided that perhaps it was a moment to question that basic assumption. And we started simply taking a poll, among people, a questionnaire. We did a questionnaire of 800 cases in the city of Buenos Aires and another 800 cases in Rio de Janeiro. And what we discovered was really striking and surprising, because we found out that psychoanalysis was, in fact, intertwined in a very dense therapeutic constellation. I prefer to talk about the therapeutic constellation instead of therapeutic culture. Therapeutic constellations, because what you have is a variety, a multiverse of ways. In which it was just one element, more important for some people, less important for others, but it was one element we had to sort of interact, compete, seek a space among other therapeutic practices that some of them, very ancient and traditional, some of them modern, but, pretending to be traditional, some of them from European origins, some of them from local origins, and so on. And we tried then to figure out how people construct their actual therapeutic constellation, instead of departing from our assumption that everybody goes to a shrink in Buenos Aires, for instance, and perhaps a lot of people go to a shrink in Buenos Aires. That is true, but what does it mean to go to a shrink in a place like Buenos Aires or in a place like Rio de Janeiro? What does it mean to go to a shrink when according to different to factors like gender or social class or level of education? And you find an extremely complex, rich, and interesting picture. And this is why we titled this article that came out in this global encyclopedia between Freud and Umbanda, because we find exactly, that therapeutic constellation go from Freud in one extreme to the Afro-Brazilian religions in the other, and a kind of assemblage, going back to this concept, which is I found extremely enriching. So this is what I'm studying now, what we are studying in this little group of people who are Pirosh Kachuri, who is a linguist that Nicolas Viotti, who is an anthropologist, and myself. And there is going to be a book that we are going to hopefully finish next year.
That's really fascinating research, and I very much look forward to seeing this research published. So thank you very much for talking about your work today. At this point, I'd like to conclude the interview. And, well, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.